This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 962 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the trends this week, I wanted to make sure you're checking out Underdog. If your fantasy football season is over, or if you're wanting to get some more action, head to Underdog. You can draft teams for playoff contests right now, and you don't need a huge bankroll to play. There's the Mitten, for instance. You can join that right now for just $5 per entry. If you haven't played yet at Underdog, make sure to use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. That'll get you a nice deposit offer once you get going. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. The first trend this week has to do with a transaction that I almost made for the 15 transaction show. But Zach Ertz left Washington's Week 15 game early with a concussion. Rookie Ben Sinnott was the one who stepped in and ran the most routes for Washington. He had 25 routes run versus John Bates' 10, Bates being the other tight end in that offense. Sinnott's been really inefficient this year in limited action. He has a .28 yards per route run rate, and I did not misspeak there. That's real. He's got 28 yards on 100 routes run according to PFF. But he could get more run if Zach Ertz is out, so he's someone to watch. Anthony Richardson has been horrible for the players in the Colts offense this year. He's now thrown 19 or more times in 9 games this season. He's finished with better than a 50% completion rate in just one of those games. Now that obviously hurts the pass catchers, but as I've said before, it's also really hurting Jonathan Taylor. Taylor had his lowest route share of the season in Week 15. He's now gone 4 straight games without a double-digit percentage target share. Jonathan Taylor, one of the most dynamic players in football, ignoring the drop ball at the goal line stuff, but Jonathan Taylor has a combined 5 targets over his last 4 games. Those are all 4 games with Anthony Richardson. It's really tough to trust the Colts right now. James Cook had a nice Week 15 against the Lions. He scored a pair of touchdowns, and he ran for over 100 yards. His usage, though, just continues to be kind of wild. He's now gone 4 straight games with a sub 50% snap share. From Week 1 through Week 10, he was below the 50% snap share mark just once. Now, it hasn't totally impacted his bottom line, but his usage actually has changed over his last 4 games. He's averaging 10.8 rush attempts and 2.5 targets per game. From weeks 1 to 10, that rush attempts number was almost 4 attempts higher. He was getting more raw targets too. Now he can finish the season strong given how well this Bills offense is playing right now. But there's definitely some volatility there. Now speaking of the Bills, part of the reason you can't trust their pass catchers is simple predictability. Amari Cooper in Week 14, so 2 games ago, he had a 63% route participation. Not super high, but it was at least usable. He ended the day with a 38% target share. In Week 15, Cooper's route participation was just 42%. He didn't see a single target. Cooper's now seen just a 53% route share since he was traded to Buffalo. His target share per game rate is 14%. There's literally no difference between Amari Cooper and a lot of waiver wire wide receivers. The only pass catcher that I would trust in this offense is Khalil Shakir. Najee Harris is coming off a game against the Eagles where he saw just a 34% snap share, the lowest of his season. His 50% running back rush share was also a season low. And because the Steelers ran so few plays, Harris had just 6 rush attempts. I'm definitely nervous about Harris in the fantasy playoffs over the next 2 weeks. But I've been nervous about Harris in the fantasy playoffs. He was a 15 transaction sell for multiple weeks over the last couple of months. Now he gets Baltimore and Kansas City to close out the fantasy season. I can't say that brings me a whole lot of confidence. He's probably going to be just a touchdown dependent player, which is largely what he's been this year anyway. Devonte Adams is absolutely destroying fantasy football right now. He scored 26 and 43 PPR points over his last 2 games, but his usage has been really good ever since he got to New York, even if the results haven't always been there. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, since Week 7, which was Adams' first game as a Jet, only Jamar Chase, Puka Nacua, and CeeDee Lamb have a higher expected fantasy points per game average than Adams does. Now, a lot of teams probably had a hard time making the playoffs with Davante Adams, But if you've got him, you've got to play him at this point. Malik Nabers has been in a horrendous situation all year, but he's been able to be a very usable piece in fantasy football for two reasons. One, talent. The dude is good, but there's also the volume piece. Nabers had a 41% target share in week 15. That's obviously a high number. That's the fourth time that he's hit at least a 40% target share in a game this season. No other wide receiver in the league has done that more than twice. So as bad as the situation's been for Nabers, at least he's been fed. And in PPR formats, that's made him a nice value overall this year. So in my prospect model, the ZAP model, Marvin Harrison Jr. was ranked almost identically to Malik Nabers. He was actually ranked below, but it wasn't by much at all. And Harrison Jr. has kind of struggled this year, at least versus expectation. He now has scored single-digit PPR points in 8 of his 14 games this year. His 1.62 yards per route run rate, it's good, but it's not elite for a rookie wide receiver. Harrison Jr. has averaged 11.1 PPR points per game. Some will say that that's just what we should expect from rookies. I don't really agree with that, though. When looking at the ZAP model, which dates back to 2011, there have been 17 wide receivers with a ZAP model score at 97 or above who played 8 or more games as a rookie. Harrison Jr.'s PPR points per game mark is 6th worst among that group, if he were to finish with an 11.1 average. Now, fortunately, of the wide receivers who finished with a score below 12, a PPR points per game average south of 12, we do have Jackson Smith-Njigba and Devonte Smith. Those are two guys who now look the part. Not all hope is lost. But Marvin Harrison's year 2 score in the year 2 model, it won't look amazing. It's not going to look as good as someone like Malik Nabers. So as you guys know, I adjust target share allowed by strength of opponent. And probably the biggest number that I see within that metric is with the New York Giants and how they've defended tight ends this year. Their opponents have targeted tight ends at a target share that's 6 percentage points lower than their season-long average. That's the biggest number for running back, wide receiver, and tight end in either direction. They've been the second best team against the position in adjusted points allowed. So we know that it's not an easy matchup. It's just crazy how well they defended the position this year for fantasy purposes. Now, because this is the last 10 Trends episode of the year, I feel like I've got to close this out by talking about pass to rush touchdown ratio. It's one of my favorite ways to look at team level regression. Now, I've mentioned in the past how the Eagles are throwing for very few touchdowns this year versus how many they're running for. But based on their overall pass rate, it's not that surprising. Like, they should have more passing touchdowns, but they are a really run-heavy team. You see, teams that run the ball more will generally have more rushing touchdowns. But we can do a little regression analysis to see what a team's expected pass-to-rush touchdown rate should be based on how frequently they're throwing the ball. The team that's been the biggest outlier, it's actually two teams. The two teams that have been the biggest outliers within that department, it's not the Eagles, who have 18 passing touchdowns and 26 rushing touchdowns. It's not the Commanders either, who have 4 more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns. It's two other teams that you probably wouldn't expect. It's the Giants and the Seahawks. Based on how frequently those teams have thrown the ball, their pass-to-rush touchdown rate, how they score their touchdowns, should skew a whole lot more towards the pass than it currently is. The Giants have just 9 passing touchdowns and 12 rushing touchdowns. The Seahawks have 14 passing touchdowns and 17 rushing touchdowns. Both of those numbers are obviously well below 50%. Their pass-to-rush touchdown rate is below 50%. But based on how they're passing, how frequently they're throwing the ball, those numbers should be closer to like 66%. So even though the quarterback situations right now at the time of this recording are kind of up in the air for both of those teams, I would still expect some regression to hit. Even if it might not, because there aren't that many games left. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. It's the same handle on Blue Sky as well. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.